Okay, so welcome to this 1 hour to understand how Brexit affects trade operations with European countries. So I will stop sharing my screen and give the hand to James WALTON from IGD, who is taking the lead now, and I'm going mute. This is all up to you, James.
Okay, thank you, Xavier. Good evening, everybody. I think it is just about evening over there in Europe. It's really good to meet you all, and thank you so much for giving IGD this very important opportunity. So, my task today is to try to outline trading arrangements for the post-EU era. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is exactly that EU businesses need to do to go on exporting successfully to the UK now that we're outside the European Union and its single market. Now, a lot of changes have already taken place. Further changes are now planned for October this year and for January of next year. And you might well have to act to protect your business with the UK. But before I go on to that, I will just take 60 seconds to introduce ourselves and our organization. You might already be familiar with IGD, which is a non-profit organization that specializes in consumer packaged goods. We're actually two communities connected together, and what we do is deliver commercial insight and social impact. We use our commercial insight to create actionable solutions for businesses in consumer packaged goods, and we reinvest the revenue that we make from that to create social impact, trying to mobilize the whole industry as a force for good. So, my name is James WALTON. I'm Chief Economist at IGD, and I've been leading our research and our activity on EU exit as part of our social impact work for quite a while now. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Naomi Kissman, who's our Strategy and Corporate Affairs Director, and she'll be helping to field some of your questions at the end. We've got about 40 minutes of prepared content for you today, and the agenda looks like this. We've aimed the content very much at consumer packaged goods in Europe, sending goods to the UK, but I'm hoping that there will be much wider interest than that. Now, this is a technical subject. Certain products do raise very specific issues, but obviously with a mixed audience, we can't explore everything. So I'm going to suggest some sources of further information in Part 3. If we're not able to answer your question from ourselves or from those sources, I would suggest talking to a customs agent. Customs agents are very much specialists in this area, and the UK government actually has a handy list of customs agents available. You can find that via Google. There'll be time at the end, as Xavier said, for Q&A and for discussion. And he's already explained how to submit your questions via chat. We'll tackle as many as we can before 6 o'clock. A PDF version of all of the slides is going to be made available after the webinar. Please do feel free to share this with your colleagues, your contacts, but just for personal use only, please, as obviously the copyright remains with IGD. So, let's start by having a look at the new trading setup between the UK and the EU. And this really lays down the basic game rules if you are a trader. Now, the physical geography of the British Isles actually makes regulating trade with the EU incredibly challenging. And so trade between the EU and the UK is now shaped by two separate documents, not just one. You've got the Northern Ireland Protocol and you've got the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA. Now, with the end of the transition period, the whole of the UK is now outside the EU Customs Union, and it's outside the EU single market. And those arrangements have been replaced by the TCA. But Northern Ireland, as you can see here, has special status, and that's laid down in the Northern Ireland Protocol. I've highlighted the key differences with dotted lines. So you can see that Northern Ireland is aligned to, but not a part of, the EU for purposes of market and product regulation. It's also managed alongside the Republic of Ireland for the purpose of disease control. There's a single epidemiological unit. And what all of that means is that goods can move out of Northern Ireland into Britain without any hindrance. But the opposite doesn't apply. So there are now limited border arrangements for moving goods out of Britain into Northern Ireland. And that applies particularly to agri-food products. Those products can actually go into Northern Ireland more easily from Ireland than they can from Great Britain. And this whole setup is extremely unusual. I can't think of anywhere in the world that has a similar setup. And making this work is proving to be a real challenge for governments and for businesses alike. Now, there are various concessions there to help businesses cope with the appearance of this new border, but all of them are, they're all time limited. And the UK government has actually decided quite recently that it will extend the timelines that all of this help will be available without any sort of prior agreement from the European Union. Now, the European Union, of course, has objected, and you may have heard that they've brought legal action. So the lawfulness of extending the timeline is being disputed, but it is pretty clear that businesses do need as much time to cope with these new arrangements as they can. Now, I don't want to say any more about Northern Ireland today. The issue is politically and culturally incredibly sensitive, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland is actually only quite a small part of the UK market. It's about 2 million people, so it's a little bit bigger than, say, Lyon. The Republic of Ireland is bigger. It's about 5 million people. Now, the Republic, of course, is still an EU member, and it is impacted by the UK leaving membership, because the geography now means that Ireland is actually isolated from the rest of the EU. There's a non-member state in between them, which raises a whole series of question marks for logistics operations. So, for example, the use of the land bridge, that is using Britain as a land bridge between Europe and Ireland, is starting to run into various problems, particularly around health and sanitary checks, and of course, the unexpected appearance of tariff liability. And so a lot of businesses in France are actually choosing now to bypass Great Britain, and the number of goods sailings from France direct to Ireland has gone up very quickly in the last couple of months. But you guys, I'm sure, are looking at EU exit from the viewpoint of exporting goods to the UK, particularly food. And that is still an incredibly valuable trade in spite of everything that's happened in the last couple of months. The UK hasn't gone anywhere, of course, and British shoppers are still very, very keen to buy and enjoy European food, European drink. Now, this is data I've taken from Eurostat, the EU statistics body. And if I've used it properly, which isn't easy with Eurostat, the EU sold 39 billion euros worth of food and drink to the UK in 2020 alone. So the UK is still a really significant customer, and it relies heavily on European food to keep the population fed. So there's a mutual interest here in making the new arrangement work. So let's move on and look at what the new arrangement actually means. So trade between the EU and the UK is now regulated primarily by this new trade deal, the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And that takes away tariffs and quotas on qualifying goods, that is, originating goods traded between the EU and the UK. Now, that's undoubtedly a really good thing if you're a shopper. It's a really good thing if you're a trader. But there are a few downsides. No deal could ever really replace the trade benefit of actually being part of a single market. So the first proviso is that for the UK at least, there is going to be some inflation here. All of the new paperwork, all of the new border arrangements are going to add cost, and somebody will have to pay for that. The second issue is that all of the tariffs could potentially be reimposed later if there was a dispute. And that's why the chart here says tariffs on hold instead of tariffs gone, if you like. And the third proviso is that only originating goods benefit from the deal. So if you're a trader, the key question then becomes, well, what is a qualifying good? Well, that's regulated by what's called the ROOs, the ROOs, the rules of origin. These are incredibly technical. They're incredibly complicated, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can. So the rules are intended to make sure that only goods that are genuinely created in either the EU or the UK get special treatment. Now, any goods that don't originate within the treaty area, you can still trade them, but they would be subject to tariffs in the usual way. So that would mean that goods brought into the UK that don't qualify would still be subject to the UK global tariff. So some of those tariffs are quite high, and that would be a really good reason to seek preference if you can. And all of this is completely normal. You know, it is normal for an international trade deal to include rules of some description. So what do we need to know? Well, the first point to note is that this preferential treatment, this treaty tariff exemption, is not automatic. An importer has to apply for the preference. So you have to take some sort of positive action to avoid tariff. The application to avoid the tariff has to be accompanied by some sort of evidence to show why the preference should be given. And that could be what's called an exporter statement, or it could be based on what's called importer knowledge. But whichever party provides it, the evidence has got to be available when you move the goods, and you've got to keep it on file for at least 4 years. The good news, I suppose, is that one piece of evidence can support multiple shipments over the course of a year. So, for example, if a British wine buyer goes to France to inspect a vineyard, then he can use that importer knowledge to cover transactions for a full year. He doesn't have to keep going back to cover each individual transaction. So when you export your goods to Britain, to the UK, your customers are going to want some sort of evidence to show why they should not pay the tariff. And that's certainly something that you might be asked to help with. But what exactly are we showing with this evidence? Well, there are 2 ways that goods can qualify as originating within either the UK or the EU. So they can be wholly obtained, or they can be substantially transformed. And the TCA, the trade deal, lays down which method you have to use for each type of product. So these are the requirements that your evidence is going to have to support. So wholly obtained, the first route, that just means that a particular product has been obtained or created completely within EU or UK territory. And some agri-food products will use that method. So the fresh tomatoes that we're seeing on here are a good example. Unprocessed tomatoes are HS code 0702. I'll explain that in a second. They're code 0702. And if we look up that code in the trade deal, in the annex, it says on page 423, goods of that type must be wholly obtained. So to get tariff exemption, the tomatoes have to come from the UK or the EU. That's what your evidence has to show. For other products, it's more complicated. Other products have to be substantially transformed within treaty territory to count as originating. So that's going to apply to most processed food and drink products. And the transformation could be demonstrated through some combination of either a big change in value, a change in the tariff code, so using tomatoes to make a pizza, as you can see here, that would count, or specified types of processing. Let's investigate that a little bit closer. So this is where your product specific rules come in. So the product specific rules, the PSRs, tell you exactly what each product has to happen to each sort of product to count as originating. So on the left here, you can see that fresh tomatoes have to be wholly obtained, as we saw before. But if you turn your non-originating tomatoes into juice, that might count, provided that you haven't put more sugar in than 40% of the product weight. We can see that canned tomatoes, though, still have to be wholly obtained. So tomatoes brought into the EU from Morocco, say, for canning probably would not gain originating status. Hopefully all of that is clear. If not, do please pick me up in the Q&A session at the end. And non-food items, of course, also have PSRs, product-specific rules. And I've picked out a few examples here that are based on the delegate list. So the paint and the cosmetics that we're seeing here would be good examples of what's called specified processing. So, for example, cosmetics can only qualify for preference by undergoing a chemical reaction, purification, mixing and blending, a change in particle size, isomer separation, or some sort of biotechnical processing. And that's all laid down in detail in the trade deal. So goods that have been substantially transformed in line with the product-specific rules can qualify as originating goods. But goods could be disqualified if there's insufficient production. And this is a rule that's causing a bit of difficulty for goods that are coming out of the EU into Ireland via GB. Goods entering GB lose their originating status unless they're processed again to a significant degree. And that's what some people are calling the Percy pig problem. So insufficient production describes minor industrial operations. And again, this is all laid down in the trade deal. So some good examples here that are relevant to agri-food business are shown. Some of them are a bit vague, so it's not clear what would count as simple packing, for example. But the British government guidance says that simple means that the process doesn't require special skills or dedicated equipment. So tea blending, for example, on the face of it is quite simple, but it has to be done by very, very skilled people. So therefore, I would suggest that tea blending, mixing the leaves together in a specified way, would probably count as adequate production. Clearly, there are a lot of traps, a lot of complexity here for businesses, lots of things that could potentially catch you out. So if in doubt, do talk to your customs intermediary. If you have one, you could talk to the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, if not, or you could consult the government advice that already exists. Now, I've made several references here to what are called HS codes. And these are what the trade deal is using to classify goods. So it's probably a good time to explain this a bit further. So the HS code system is an international standard created by the World Customs Organization. And it uses number codes organized into a hierarchy with lower levels describing the goods more and more precisely. So the highest level in the hierarchy is the section, and there's 21 of those. And below that, you've got your chapters, your headings, your subheadings, and in some cases, suffixes as well. So if we look at the tomato ketchup on the picture, what we can see is the tomato ketchup is section 4, code 210320 with no suffixes. And the TCA, the trade deal, specifies for each product how far it has to move across the hierarchy in order to be considered to be transformed, so how much the number has to change. The HS system is quite detailed, it's quite comprehensive, but it's not necessarily ideal for describing certain composite food products, and like the pizza that I showed earlier on, or perhaps a chicken curry meal with rice. So that's what we're doing around tariffs. What about the other regulations? Well, when the UK left the EU, all laws, all regulations that were derived from the EU were retained. And that means there's a certain amount of stability. There's been no sudden legal dislocation, if you like. But under the terms of the New Deal, the EU and the UK are now regulating their markets separately. So over time, it is quite possible that the two markets will actually diverge in terms of regulation. There's no recognition of regulatory equivalence, except at the moment in the area of organic foods. The deal does, though, include what are called no regression clauses in areas like employment or environment. So neither party can actually reduce legal protection in ways that would create a competitive advantage or unfairness. And that certainly helps to address some of the issues that were raised by the EU. But there is no requirement for one party to follow the other. There's no requirement for what's called dynamic alignment. So if one side tightens regulation, there is no requirement for the other side to follow suit. As I said, mutual recognition for organic standards, which is great news for small food producers particularly, so perhaps organic French wineries, but it is only a short-term measure, and you can see it only lasts until the end of December this year. We don't know yet what's going to happen after that point. And of course, agri-food crossing the border is now subject to sanitary and phytosanitary checks. The EU has implemented this immediately. The UK is implementing it gradually, and I'll show a chart on that later on. But this need for checks, the need for pre-notification, lots of extra paperwork, inevitably, this is going to increase the difficulty and the cost of doing trade for traders. So we've removed the tariffs, we've removed the quotas for goods that move between the UK and the EU if they qualify. But it doesn't allow for completely free trade. There are these new admin procedures that traders have to follow. The EU has implemented those from January the 1st. And in line with the Northern Ireland Protocol, that applies to movements into Northern Ireland as well. GB, Great Britain, is implementing change gradually. So we had minor changes in January, but the big changes that are going to affect agri-food are going to happen in October this year and January of next year. The imposition of new border measures, that did hit trade with the EU in January. And if you look at the right-hand end of this chart, what you can see is that the food trade in both directions actually fell off very sharply in January of this year. So exports of food and drink from the UK to the EU fell 60% in January. This wasn't necessarily due to EU exit, because we know there were lots of other issues happening as well. You know, we had coronavirus, we had problems with containers, we had bad weather in the English Channel. All of those things may well have contributed as well. But happily, it seems that trade is flowing much more smoothly now than it was in January. Traffic in the current month seems to be more or less back at the previous level, but there is going to be a burden there still for both businesses and officials. In the original version of this script, I did refer to all of these new business and administrative requirements as being barriers to trade. And that's what an economist would say. But I think it's important to recognize that these measures are not intended to prevent trade. They're actually there to safeguard businesses and to safeguard the public. And from that point of view, new border arrangements could be seen as facilitating trade, not blocking it. Still, initially, the UK government focused very much on ensuring smooth movement of goods out of the UK into Europe. But as I said, the UK is very heavily reliant on import of goods, particularly food. Food from overseas makes up about 1/3 of everything that we eat in this country. So the UK government is now shifting to facilitating import from the EU. The big border changes, as I said, October and January. And the successful implementation of that is going to depend very heavily on whether trading partners in Europe are ready. And unfortunately, we don't know very much about that. We can't really offer that much insight to the degree and the quality of preparation in Europe. So if you have any insight, do please let us know. Perhaps you could put it into the chat section. The UK government is providing a lot of guidance for traders in Europe, helping them to get ready for the new border arrangements. And the EU has also run various workshops and advice programs, but don't rely completely on those government projects. You should also reach out to your partners to make sure that they're ready, particularly in very technical markets like live animals, for example. UK border development is guided by this thing called the BOM, the Border Operating Model. And the implementation of that is being done by the Cabinet Office. So it's being done at the very highest level of government. And the BOM lays down everything that businesses need to do to be border ready. The changes apply both to traders and to the hauliers and shippers who are actually moving the goods. The current version is the third. There will be a fourth version very, very soon. And this really is the definitive document. It's not an easy read, though. So if you're not a masochist, I would suggest looking at the book of case studies. That's easier going. And the book of case studies gives you full flow charts, full step-by-step guides for trade between the UK and the EU, whether you're exporting or importing. And the current edition covers things like fish, plants, engine parts, that sort of thing. Worth noting, by the way, that the BOM doesn't describe the final vision for the UK border. So there is actually a much longer term program intended to make the border work better, using technology to make it as seamless as possible. I said that a fourth version of the BOM is coming. That's because timings for implementation have changed within the last 10 days or so. So the government has responded to business concerns, and it's pushed back the implementation of stage 2 and stage 3 by 6 months. And I've shown you here the new timings for each of the major stages. Now, this is something that the UK government can do unilaterally. It doesn't need consent from the EU, as it did with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And this extra time that we have means that both officials and businesses have got much more breathing space to deal with. But it is really important to use this time as widely as possible. It's not an excuse to take our eye off the ball. And note in particular the need to prepare for both physical and document checks for agri-food products. So what exactly do you have to do? Brings us to part 3. We'll look at that next. Before we do, though, one key thing to bear in mind is that UK is not a single country. It's actually a group of 4 countries. So some laws, some regulations do vary from country to country, but under the Internal Markets Act, a product that is legal for sale in one of the UK countries can be sold in any of them. Enforcement of the laws, a bit more uncertain. So enforcement of food regulations particularly is in the hands of local authorities. So the approach might vary a little bit depending on where you happen to be. So your first task as an exporter is, can you get your goods out of Europe? And that in itself could be quite a complicated task. There are several procedures that apply, particularly now the UK is seen as an export market. Note in particular, you've got to have an export health certificate from April of 2021. Now that's a change that was planned before the UK began to leave the EU, so it should be well in hand by now. But bear in mind that an export health certificate is an incredibly complicated document. It goes on for page after page after page. A lot of detailed information is needed to fill one in successfully. And each different item that you export has to have its own health certificate. Each one has to be signed off individually, load by load, by qualified vets. This is actually quite a specialist role for the vet. And qualified willing vets are currently in quite short supply on both sides of the board. So that could be a bottleneck. If you haven't got a vet now, you need to get one as soon as possible. If the importer wants to apply for a tariff exemption, they have to provide the evidence, and you might be asked to help with that. The evidence has to show that you meet those rules of origin for your particular product category. So you need to know your HS code and then look up your product category within the deal. If you don't know which code will apply to your product, you can ask UK authorities for what's called a binding tariff ruling. And that is the ultimate legal say as to what tariff code applies to your product. And that will give you legal cover if there is a problem. You should also review your contracts to make sure that your contracts are fit for purpose, allocating responsibility for each job very clearly. And you might find something called Incoterms helpful here. Incoterms is again, a standardized international model set of contract terms. You don't have to use them, but you might find it helpful. Your next task, once you've decided that your goods are ready to go, is you've got to make sure that they are legal for sale in the UK. The good news on this, I suppose, is that as we left the EU, EU law was absorbed into UK law. And that body of law remains in place. So most food and drink regulations have not changed yet. Generally, food that's legal for sale in the EU will still be legal for sale in the EU. But there are a few differences. So labeling is one of those. Labeling is a key concern to a lot of the businesses that we've been talking to over the last couple of months. In the EU, the labeling change has been enforced straight away. In the UK, you have a little bit more time, at least for goods that you want to sell in Great Britain. Northern Ireland, of course, is the exception to that. Probably the bit that's causing people most difficulty when it comes to labeling is what's called the FBO, the Food Business Operator Address. So the FBO address shows the business that has responsibility for the goods. So that could be your business, could be your distributor, it could be a retailer if it's private label goods. But if you want to sell the goods in Great Britain, you have to have an FBO address on the label that is in the UK. If you want to sell goods in Northern Ireland, that address has to be in either EU or Northern Ireland, but you can have multiple addresses on one pack. The purpose of the FBO address is to make sure that there is somewhere that legal papers could be served if you had some sort of problem. So it has to be the address of a physical location. You can't put an email address, you can't just put a phone number. You can use a PO box address or the address of an agent like a lawyer or an accountant. But even if you're doing that, you have to have an address somewhere. In other words, there has to be a door that somebody could knock on. So your business is ready to export. You've ensured that your goods are legal for sale in the UK. Your next step is to get your goods in. Depending on your product category, that could be quite complicated. Generally, it's the job of the importer and the haulier to ensure that they are complying with the border procedure, but they might call on you, the producer, to help them support that process. And obviously, it makes sense to cooperate, or the export sale might be lost. The border admin is going to be easier and quicker if you can fill a whole vehicle with your products. If you can't do that, you might have to combine with other businesses, and that's what's called groupage. Groupage does make the logistics much more effective, but there is a snag. If it's a group load, everything in the load has to comply with border regulations, or everything is going to be stopped. And again, this is a problem that's already starting to appear on the Irish sea route. Different products are going to have different procedures to get them into the UK. And the BOM, the Border Operating Model, lays down flow charts for all different types of products at each stage of the transition process. I'm not going to go through all of them because you'll just want to die, but this is an example. It's a simplified version for the final process for products of animal origin. This actually covers quite a lot of ground because animal origin would obviously mean things like meat and dairy, but it also covers things that you might not expect. And I actually ran into somebody who was selling cheese-flavored crisps, and he was rather put out in that his cheese-flavored crisps also were classed as products of animal origin because there was dairy product in the flavoring. I've shown here the exporter processes in orange. So the exporter responsibility in this case is primarily to provide that vital export health certificate and to provide complete exit paperwork for the products. Most of the other tasks can be left over to the haulier or to the importer, but there's a couple of issues to just take on board. First of all, as an importer, you have to give notice to the management system for food imports, which is called IPAFs. That means that there's a degree of drag built into the system. A couple of months ago, you could load up a truck and send it off to the UK without any sort of delay. Now you have to allow at least 24 hours delay. You have to give notice to IPAF before the load arrives. And also, before you talk to IPAF, you've got to have all of the information in hand. So the importer will need all of the information from the exporter to make the registration with IPAFs. Second point is that goods have got to go through the appropriate border control post that has the right facilities for the product. And that will influence the route that you take into the UK. And the third point is that your goods may be chosen for a physical inspection or even lab tests, and fees would be payable for both the inspections and the tests. I'm aware that not everybody on the call is in food and drink. We do have some chemical businesses, some cosmetics businesses involved as well. So for those businesses, one thing that you do need to be aware of is this issue of REACH compliance. So the UK is now outside of EU REACH, which is the system for regulating chemicals. But the UK now has its own system, which is also called REACH. Any chemicals that you bring into the UK have to be REACH compliant. And that will apply particularly to anything novel or new that you want to bring in. You can't bring it in until it's been registered with REACH. So your haulier has made the delivery. They now want to come back to the EU. That might not be completely straightforward. Getting back into the EU might actually be harder than it is to get out. Now, the government has set up various sites in Kent and in other parts of the UK to help drivers prepare for the border on the way out. They can check their documents, they can get advice, they can even get a coronavirus test if one of them is needed to go home. But do remember that before a driver exits the UK, they have to use a portal which is called Check an HGV is ready to cross the border. And this is just a basic test. So you go online and you check off the presence of all of the different documents that you need. And the idea is that you check that you're ready before you arrive at the channel ports or at the channel tunnel. If you can answer yes to all of the questions on the portal, you get what's called the Kent Access Permit. Any HGV driver who is in Kent without a Kent Access Permit could be liable to a big, big fine, and you would have to pay that personally. But the good news is that the Kent Access Permit is it is a temporary measure. It's not expected to last forever, but for the moment, that is still the law. Wooden pallets, we can deal with this very quickly. All wooden pallets, all wooden packaging materials have to be heat treated before they cross the UK border in either direction. And that includes movements between GB and Northern Ireland. So heat treat all of your pallets in order to be safe. And there was one other thing I was asked to tackle before we move on to FAQs. It doesn't really fit in anywhere else, so I'll deal with it here. When the UK was inside the EU, it was very easy for British shoppers to order goods online from other EU countries. And when they did it, they paid VAT at the local rate. So the product would be priced to include that VAT payment. And the money was raised and it was passed on to whichever government was in control. So as an online shopper, what you got was a really smooth process. Today, with the UK outside the EU, retailers in the EU must not include VAT when they present goods to British shoppers. That's because goods that are sent into the UK count as exports. They're not domestic sales anymore. But the customer is still liable to the tax. And if it's a small transaction, you have to pay that personally before you can get the package. For a larger transaction, the retailer is supposed to charge VAT on behalf of the British government. But that does mean that you have to register with the UK VAT system. And it's not clear that a lot of European retailers have actually done that. And as an online shopper in the UK, you could also be hit by things like import duty and handling fees and foreign currency costs. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that there is actually an easy solution to that beyond setting up here in the UK. So just coming to the end now. I've gone on for quite a long time, but we've only really been able to scratch the surface of EU exit. We'll go to Q&A in a second, but there are lots of other information sources you might want to explore. Selection of them is shown here. Of these, I would suggest visiting the EU Exit Food Hub first. Now, this is actually a private venture. It's been delivered by various food trade organisations, including IGD. We've aimed it at UK businesses that want to bring food in from the EU, but it will give you a very simple view of some of the issues that your UK partners are currently wrestling with. And we've written it very simply in the series, in the form of FAQs. So hopefully it's much easier to deal with than the official government sources, which are quite technical. So that's all I have to say. That's the end of the prepared content. Now let's move on to Q&A. Hopefully we have some questions on already. There's still time to ask a few more. And at this point, I'm going to bring in my colleague Naomi to see if she can join me. Xavier, would you like to pose any questions that you've had come in?
Sure. I'm not sure I got everything, I understood everything about the complexity. It seems very, very tough anyway. A question from Christoph. James, how will the new National Food Strategy and Agricultural Bill 2020 affect imports of food into the UK?
That sounds like one for you, Naomi.
Well, why don't I start with National Food Strategy, and perhaps you can have a think about the agricultural bill. I'd say probably for both of those, we don't yet know or are not entirely clear. So there is a process underway at the moment to develop a new national food strategy for England, although the expectation is that some of the recommendations in that strategy will be adopted by all 4 nations. In terms of the timing, so we are expecting publication of part 2 of that strategy in July. And then there will then be a period of 6 months in which the UK government DEFRA, Department for Food and Agriculture, will need to respond to the recommendations in that report. So it will only be, I think, at that stage that it becomes clear in terms of which of the recommendations they intend to accept and progress. But I think the expectation that we have is that the objective is for a transformational change of the food systems. So we are expecting some very bold recommendations for industry and for government. So that is likely to include further regulation. We will be keeping our stakeholders updated. So do keep an eye on igd.com, and we will share information as and when we have it.
Yeah, and on the agriculture bill, clearly with the UK leaving the EU, we've become detached from the EU system for agricultural regulation and agricultural subsidy, and that's now been replaced with a domestic act, if you like. Food and farming are one of those things that are regulated separately depending on where you are in the UK. But if we take England, what we're seeing is that farmers will continue to receive subsidies from the state from the time being at roughly the level that they would have got within the EU. But the way the subsidies are delivered is going to change. So subsidies will no longer be given just for managing a piece of land or for producing a certain amount of food. Instead, the subsidies are going to be targeted very specifically at what are called public goods. So public goods could be maintaining a footpath for hikers, or digging a flight pond for ducks, or maintaining a hedge. But you will get payments for specific things and for provision of specific public benefits. You won't get them for food production. And so farmers are going to be gradually weaned off the old system and put onto the new system. It will be, again, Naomi used the word transformational. It is intended to be transformational for UK agriculture, but I don't necessarily think it will make food production in the UK any cheaper than it is now.
Okay, thanks a lot, James and Naomi. There are no other questions, so I have one question on my side. We have also in the participants, in the delegates attending the webinar, people from transport companies, and especially from transport companies transporting frozen food. So if you have some, if I understood well, you have a delay, you need to have 24 hours before you can actually ship the goods to the UK. So of course, you will not have your truck waiting 24 hours plugged somewhere to have to keep the temperature at the right level. But is there an expectation that as the lead time will increase, then there will be different processes for the inventory levels or the replenishment processes and so on? Are they anticipated to change in the UK from importing companies?
Shall I take that one? Okay. One of the issues that is going to affect people who are running international production and international logistics is that up to this point, food or other goods have tended to be produced without necessarily knowing who who is going to get the final product or where it is going to go. And so, for example, you might produce 10,000 bags of coffee a day, and then divide them up according to the customer orders that come in. Because any food leaving the EU and coming to the UK will need registration on IPAFs and possibly an export health certificate, you have to know where those things are going to go. You have to know that those things are going to come to the UK in order to register them. And therefore, it is a bit of a puzzler for manufacturers. So do they produce goods specifically for the UK knowing that they might not all be ordered? Or do they just register everything with and get an export health certificate for everything just in case it is ordered? It's extremely difficult, unfortunately. And again, it's one of those things that I don't think we've necessarily got to the bottom of as yet. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is for hauliers, haulage is also covered by the TCA. Haulage services are also covered by the trade deal that we have. And although hauliers can operate across the border, their ability to do what's called cabotage is now much more limited than it used to be. And of course, cabotage is one of the mechanisms that is used to make international logistics more efficient. If you can't do cabotage, perhaps the cost of sending goods to the UK will be higher than it was before.
Okay. Thank you. So no other question on the chat. I just asked the participants if they wanted to ask a question in French in the chat. I would probably be able to translate it in English for you, but no answer from them. Either it is too complex or you have answered a lot of points in both ways. I thank you, both of you, Naomi and James, a lot for this presentation. Yes, Naomi.
Sorry, could I just say one thing if there are no more questions? So James, during his presentation, talked about the UK government's decision to delay import checks for another 6 months, and how important it is to use that extra time that we have to prepare. I just wanted to really emphasise that message. So we know that if you need to appoint a customs agent, there is a shortage. And so actually using that time to tell a customs agent that you will require their services so they can start to plan for that increase in demand. And just to say that our government officials have been very, very clear that there will not be a further extension to that deadline. So I know that some people have thought that, we could just keep continuing to push it back, but they are being very clear that that will not happen, and those deadlines are fixed. So I just wanted to emphasize that point.
Very clear. Thanks a lot, Naomi, for that. Indeed, don't wait if you have not done everything yet. Don't wait the last minutes to be sure that you are ready to do trade with the UK. So thanks a lot again, James. Thanks, Naomi. Thank you for all participants. So the replay will be available before the end of the week. I cannot say exactly tomorrow, but before the end of the week, as well as the PDF presentation that James just shared with you. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a nice evening and see you soon on any of our webinars.